4. The Silent in the Land. The history of Christian sectarianism is as old as that of the Church itself. The violent differences between the Mother Church and the schismatics have always been the same. The sects will not forego the shaping of life, of real, everyday life, according to the impulses of Christianity. Thus, the orders for monks and nuns sprang into existence within Catholicism. Within Protestantism, they appeared as peasant revolution and Anabaptism. Both met bloody extermination. Like Uriel de Costa, Martin Luther, the new pope himself, stirred up the fire of annihilation. From then on, the sects became pietistic, retiring within, dedicated to contemplation and the secret interpretation of the scriptures, like Spinoza. The conflict with the outside world went on noiselessly. Each party left aggression to the opposition. To be satisfied with the minute portion of outward life avoids offering unprotected flanks. The Silent in the Land also resembled Miss Spinoza's economically, they managed with a minimum of economic foundation as small craftsmen and traders, while he, as we have already seen, lived by the grinding of lenses and on small pensions which were granted him first by the bequest of a friend and afterwards through the generous insight of Stadtholder de Witt, whose friend he was. These Regenburgers fitted splendidly into the flat green Dutch landscape with its bright sky and many waterways, and so did Spinoza with his gentle manner and his meditation of rose leaves, with which he combated his cough. The keenness of his perception and dedication was but strengthened by the landscape. Outwardly he did not differ from his companions. He shared their joys and sorrows. His reserved intellectual manner had its counterpart in their low German silence and composure. A conversation about the sermon, a consolation concerning the beyond, after just and quiet life, and admonition to the children whose blonde heads peopled the homes, a pipe of tobacco smoked in the peace of evening before the door. This was Spinoza's intercourse with his landlords in the later years of his life. He actually covered only a very small radius in his travels. For 5 years he lived in Albuquerque, then in 1660 he moved to the citadel of Regenburgers, the suburb of Regensburg, close to the university town of Leyden, which residence he exchanged 3 years later for the little village of Voorburg, near the capital, The Hague, and from there he moved to The Hague itself, perhaps to be nearer to De Witt, in the beautiful, spacious city with its many little woods and great square embanked sea basin. He lived first on the Verquay and at the house of the brave lady who in her youth had rescued the great jurist Grotius from imprisonment. Later he lived with the Paviljochensgracht with the portrait painter Van der Spijak, whose picture of Spinoza is the best likeness we possess. He painted him in his 39th year. The room which Spinoza inhabited there, with its wood paneling and beamed ceiling and the little mirror next to the bright window, was just destined to be his death chamber. Spinoza's health may very likely have always been frail. Tuberculosis, or in the language of his own day, consumption, need not necessarily have been his hereditary portion, yet in the harsh and anti-hygienic conditions under which his life ran its course, he might easily have inhaled it with the dust of the books, like Mozart or Aeschylus, and his life ended like theirs. He lived to be only 44. His best, his bust, his bust is in the garden of the Spinoza House and in several other places in Holland. But his real life, which is not threatened by death, he was lived in the world of ideas and in intellectual exchange with men. Even in his lifetime, the real aura of this figure began to take form through his correspondence and his circle of friends, relations with men like Huygens and Leibniz, Henrik Aldsberg, the secretary of the Royal Society of Sciences, and Jean Douet, the great Condé, tried to induce him to dedicate a book to Louis XIV, which would have brought him a considerable yearly salary. Spinoza, however, politely declined, just as he declined the flattering call to Heidelberg, which the Count Palatine Karl Ludwig sent him. Conversation with friends. The page of the letter, a small book. These were the only realities upon which his mind would still depend. Thinking, reading, writing, and the improvement of what had been written filled his days. For reading, he had 4 languages at his disposal: Spanish, Dutch, Hebrew, and Latin. For his philosophy, only the last named. During his lifetime, he permitted only trusted friends to glance at the manuscripts of his major works, especially his Ethics. He had only one of his works published and circulated under his name, and another without it, and he had enough annoyance from it. That was the theological political treatise in which he set down his political creed and a grandiose vision of state and freedom. For he, like his friend Douet, was an enlightened Republican and Democrat, an opponent of all orthodoxy and of all absolutism, without overestimating the masses as they were. He fought from inward conviction to secure for them the greatest possible measure of development with the least possible guardianship. For this he had to suffer vile abuse as long as 100 years after his death. Only we of today can once more estimate the meaning of the word Spinozist during those 100 years. All we need to do is replace it with Bolshevik. He was accused of the utmost impious boldness, a delight in dragging down and destroying all that was holy with atheism and hypocrisy. The reproach of being a Spinozist spelled finis even for him who had only to defend himself against it. In our day, again, men like Freud and Einstein have the pain and the honor to draw upon themselves the utmost infuriating distortion, persecution, and deprivation for pointing the way forward with their thinking. The most malicious pieces of boorishness were achievements of the persons, especially the Germans. Their words cannot be quoted here because their vocabulary equaled that of the present-day Nazis in vulgarity, and like the Nazis, they used it against all other adversaries, like our age. Because of the World War, theirs had been profoundly demoralized by the 30 Years' War. But the Dutch parsons also never ceased their harassing attacks, and Spinoza's sensitive and solitary spirit needed all its philosophic equanimity and strength to raise itself above them. But this he never lacked. He was the most modest and also the most impenetrable among those of his stature. Beyond that, the theological political treatise could be called a great success. It was included in the Index of the Roman Catholic Church in 1671, the Calvinist National Church of Holland, and in 1674 the State General forbade it, and not only for those reasons was it greedily read. Several editions followed one another under false title pages, disguised now as medical treatises, now as historical works. Pamphlets appeared against it, and even during the last year of his life, Spinoza interrupted the writing of his new political thesis to provide a new edition of the Theosophical Political one with explanatory interpretations. But death took the pen from his hand. Hardly had he noticed that his illness had taken a turn for the worst when he succumbed. He expired on Sunday, 21st February 1677, in the presence of his friend and physician, Ludwig Meyer, and on 25th February he was buried in the new church on the Spui, S-P-U-I. Although he had never embraced Christianity, but in contrast to the obsequies of Schiller and Mozart, who were buried without witnesses, his burial was attended, despite bad weather, by many distinguished men of the capital, and 6 carriages followed his coffin. For although misunderstanding and obscurity among the common people are part of his fate of genius, the small circle of those who, during his lifetime, have felt a breath of his greatness and who bear witness to it are just as surely another part. The very year of his death, a volume of his literary remains, containing among others his ethics, were brought out by his Amsterdam publisher and was forbidden the following year. The reactionary forces strove in vain to destroy the dead man. An afterglow set in 100 years later, after the time had come and Europe had caught up with the head start this anticipating genius had possessed. And after another 100 years, a statue was erected in his honor in The Hague, and one cannot properly demand more for a real genius. Three, spiritual physiognomy. More D.